The fog rolled in thick and heavy over Silver Hollow, blanketing the small mountain town in an oppressive shroud of gray. Sarah Calloway stood at the window of her childhood home, watching as familiar streets disappeared into the encroaching mist. It had been nearly a decade since she'd last set foot in this house, and the weight of memory pressed down upon her like a physical force. She'd sworn never to return, yet here she was, drawn back by the inescapable gravity of family tragedy. Her mother's passing had been sudden, unexpected, a heart attack in the night, they said. But as Sarah stared into the swirling mist, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Something in the air felt wrong, charged with a tension she couldn't quite name. A soft creaking sound from upstairs made her start. The house was old, she reminded herself. It was bound to make noises. And yet, Sarah found herself straining to listen, her heart quickening as she waited for the sound to repeat itself. Silence stretched on, broken only by the soft patter of mist condensing on the window pane. As she made her way to the kitchen, Sarah's eyes fell upon the stack of condolence cards on the side table. She'd barely glanced at them since arriving, too overwhelmed by the task of sorting through her mother's belongings. Now, feeling a pang of guilt, she picked up the topmost envelope. The card inside was unremarkable, a generic message of sympathy printed in flowing script. But as Sarah went to return it to its envelope, a small slip of paper fell out, fluttering to the floor. Frowning, she bent to retrieve it. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges frayed. Upon it, written in a spidery hand she didn't recognize, were the words, "Beware the night weavers. They come for us all in the end." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The night weavers. Why did that name sound so familiar? A vague memory stirred, of hushed conversations overheard as a child, of her grandmother's warnings never to venture into the woods after dark. But surely it was nothing more than local folklore, the kind of superstition that flourished in isolated mountain towns. She was about to crumple the paper and toss it away when a movement outside the window caught her eye. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a tall, impossibly thin figure gliding through the mist. But when she blinked, there was nothing there but swirling gray. Shaking her head, Sarah stuffed the slip of paper into her pocket. She was letting her imagination run wild, seeing things that weren't there. What she needed was a good night's sleep. Tomorrow she'd start the process of sorting through her mother's things, of putting this house and all its ghosts behind her for good. As she climbed the stairs to her old bedroom, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The house seemed to creak and groan around her, as if resenting her presence after so long an absence. In her room, she quickly changed and slipped under the covers, willing sleep to come quickly. But sleep, when it finally claimed her, brought no respite. Sarah's dreams were a chaotic swirl of images and sensations. She saw vast, intricate webs stretching between the trees, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Tall, shadow-cloaked figures moved silently through the forest, their too many limbs weaving complex patterns in the air. And always, she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her, measuring, judging, waiting. Sarah awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The bedroom was pitch black, the silence absolute. For a moment she lay perfectly still, straining her ears for any sound. There, a soft rustling, barely audible. It seemed to be coming from just outside her window. Slowly, carefully, Sarah rose from the bed and crept to the window. The mist had cleared somewhat, allowing slivers of moonlight to penetrate the gloom. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Stretching between the trees at the edge of the property was an enormous web, its silken strands gleaming silver in the moonlight. It was far too large, too intricate to have been made by any normal spider. And there, at its center, Sarah stumbled back from the window, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream. For a brief, terrible moment, she'd seen a figure crouched in the center of the web. A figure with too many limbs, its body cloaked in shadow. By the time she worked up the courage to look again, both the figure and the web had vanished, leaving no trace behind. Sarah sank to the floor, her mind reeling. It wasn't possible. She must still be dreaming. or the stress and grief were causing her to hallucinate. And yet, the slip of paper in her pocket suddenly felt as heavy as a stone. Beware the night weavers. They come for us all in the end. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for her phone, intending to call someone, anyone. But as the screen lit up, she saw that it was barely past midnight. Who could she possibly call at this hour? And what would she say? That she'd seen impossible webs and imaginary monsters? No, she needed to calm down, to think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation for what she'd seen. In the morning, everything would make sense. It had to. As Sarah climbed back into bed, she tried to convince herself that she was being foolish. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that by returning to Silver Hollow, she had set in motion events long in the making. Sleep eluded her for the rest of the night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind through the trees outside, sent her heart racing. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, Sarah's eyes were gritty with exhaustion, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. With the first rays of sunlight, she threw off the covers and hurried to the window. The forest looked perfectly ordinary in the pale morning light, no sign of the impossible web she'd seen in the night. Sarah let out a shaky breath. It had been a dream, nothing more. A product of stress and an overactive imagination, and yet, as she turned away from the window, something caught her eye. There, clinging to the corner of the windowsill, was a single strand of silk. As Sarah watched, it caught the light, shimmering with an iridescence that seemed somehow wrong, somehow other. With a choked gasp, Sarah stumbled back, her foot catching on the rug. She went down hard, her elbow striking the bedside table. Pain lanced up her arm, and she bit back a cry. As she struggled to her feet, her eyes fell upon an old leather-bound book that had fallen from the table in her fall. The book lay open on the floor, its yellowed pages exposed. And there, written in the same spidery hand as the note she'd found the night before, was a single sentence that made Sarah's blood run cold. "The weavers have marked us, and we are bound to their design." Sarah slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. This was madness. She needed to get out of this house, out of this town. She'd call a real estate agent, put the place on the market, and never look back. But even as the thought formed, Sarah knew it was futile. Something had been set in motion, something that had been waiting for her return all these years. The webs were already forming, invisible threads drawing tighter with each passing moment. As if in response to her thoughts, a shadow passed across the window. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart in her throat. But there was nothing there, just the branches of the old oak tree swaying gently in the morning breeze. With a deep breath, Sarah forced herself to calm down. She was letting her imagination run wild, seeing threats where there were none. What she needed was a clear head and a plan of action. First things first, she needed more information. Determined to make sense of what was happening, Sarah began to search the house methodically. She started in her mother's bedroom, rifling through drawers and closets, looking for anything that might shed light on the strange events of the night before. At first she found nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual accumulation of a life long lived. Old photographs, faded letters, the detritus of decades. But as she worked her way through a stack of old notebooks, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. With a sense of trepidation, Sarah bent to retrieve it. The paper was old, its creases well worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. As she opened it, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was a letter dated nearly 50 years ago. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone in great distress. Sarah began to read, her eyes widening with each line. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the burden I have carried for so long now falls to you. I had hoped to spare you this knowledge, to break the chain that has bound our family for generations. But the weaver's design is not so easily undone. You must listen carefully, for there is much you need to know, and I fear my time grows short. The night weavers are real as the ground beneath your feet, the air in your lungs. They have walked these woods since time immemorial, spinning webs not just of silk, but of fate itself. Our family has long been entangled in their design. Your great-grandmother, in her folly, sought to commune with them, believing they held the key to ultimate knowledge. But such knowledge comes at a terrible price. The weavers granted her visions, yes, but in doing so they bound her and all her descendants to their will. I have spent my life trying to unravel this curse, to free us from the weaver's grasp. But I fear I have only tightened the threads around us. The more I struggled, the more entangled I became. You must be strong, my daughter. The weavers will come for you as they came for me, as they came for your grandmother. They will offer you visions, promise you power beyond imagining. But do not be deceived. Their gifts are poison, their promises ash. There is a way to break free, I believe. Hidden in the depths of the forest there is an ancient altar, the source of the weaver's power in this realm. If it can be destroyed, perhaps the web that binds us can be undone. But be warned, the path is treacherous, and the weavers will do everything in their power to stop you. I have left you what guidance I can in the old book hidden beneath the floorboards in your room. Use it wisely, and trust no one. The weavers have eyes and ears everywhere, even among those who seem most trustworthy. Remember, my darling, the threads of fate are strong but not unbreakable. Your choices, your will, these are the weapons the weavers fear most. Use them well. With all my love and all my sorrow. Your mother. Sarah's hands shook as she lowered the letter. Her mind reeled, unable to fully process what she had just read. It was impossible, insane, and yet, it explained so much. The strange tensions she'd always felt in this house, the whispered conversations that would stop the moment she entered her room, her mother's insistence that she leave Silver Hollow and never return. A soft thud from downstairs snapped Sarah out of her dazed state. She froze, listening intently. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, unmistakably, the creak of a floorboard. Someone or something was in the house. Sarah's heart pounded as she slowly rose to her feet, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She needed to get to her room to find the book her mother had mentioned. But first, she had to know what was down there. As quietly as she could, Sarah crept to the bedroom door and eased it open. The hallway beyond was empty, shadows gathering in the corners despite the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, then stepped out into the hall. The stairs loomed before her, a descent into uncertainty. Sarah placed her foot on the first step, wincing at the faint creak. She paused, listening. Nothing. Slowly, carefully, she made her way down, every sense alert for the slightest sound or movement. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah's eyes were drawn to the front door. It stood slightly ajar, a thin ribbon of mist curling around its edge. She was certain she'd locked it the night before. A flicker of movement in her peripheral vision made Sarah spin around. There, in the shadows of the living room, she caught a glimpse of something impossible, a mass of threads hanging in the air like a partially formed web. But even as she focused on it, the image seemed to waver and dissolve. Sarah blinked hard, convinced her tired mind was playing tricks on her. When she looked again, the room appeared normal. And yet, was that a faint glimmer in the corner? A barely perceptible pattern in the dust motes floating in a shaft of sunlight? A sudden gust of wind slammed the front door shut, making Sarah jump. She whirled around, her heart racing. And there, pinned to the inside of the door by a thread of silk so fine it was almost invisible, was a scrap of paper. With trembling fingers, Sarah plucked it free. Written upon it in that same spidery hand were 5 words that turned her blood to ice. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah stumbled back from the door, the scrap of paper falling from her trembling fingers. The words seemed to burn in her mind. "We've been waiting for you." The weavers knew she was here. They had always known. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and Sarah gripped the banister to steady herself. She needed to think, to plan. But how could she possibly outmaneuver beings that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of reality itself? The book, her mother's book. It was her only hope of understanding what she was up against. With renewed determination, Sarah hurried back up the stairs, wincing at every creak and groan of the old wood. In her room, she knelt beside the loose floorboard, her fingers scrabbling at the edges until it came free. The space beneath was dark and musty, filled with decades of dust. But there, nestled in the gloom, was a leather-bound volume. Sarah reached in and carefully extracted it, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The book was old, its binding cracked and worn. As Sarah opened it, a slip of paper fluttered out, landing on the floor beside her. She picked it up, her breath catching as she read the message scrawled upon it. "The webs are everywhere. Trust nothing you see." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She turned her attention to the book itself, flipping through its yellowed pages. It was filled with a cramped, hurried handwriting. Her mother's, she realized with a start. Interspersed with the text were strange diagrams, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when Sarah wasn't looking directly at them. As she delved deeper into the book, Sarah felt a growing sense of unreality. Her mother wrote of the night weavers in detail, describing their appearance, their habits, the complex web of influence they had spun over Silver Hollow for generations. But more than that, she wrote of their purpose, a purpose so vast and alien that Sarah's mind recoiled from it. The weavers, her mother claimed, were not of this world. They existed in the spaces between realities, spinning webs that connected and shaped the very fabric of existence. Their work in Silver Hollow was but a small part of a design so complex that no human mind could hope to comprehend it. And yet, as Sarah read on, she began to see patterns emerging. The weavers' influence in the town was not random. They seemed to be working towards something, manipulating events and people over generations to achieve some inscrutable goal. A passage near the end of the book caught Sarah's eye. "I believe I have found a way to break their hold, to unravel the web they have woven around us. But the cost, oh, the cost is terrible. To undo their work would be to unmake reality itself, to tear apart the very fabric of our world. And yet, what choice do we have? To live as puppets, dancing to the tune of beings beyond our comprehension? No. Better to risk everything than to live as slaves to the weaver's design." Sarah's hands shook as she closed the book. The implications of what she had read were staggering. If her mother was right, then the fate of not just Silver Hollow, but perhaps all of reality, hung in the balance. A soft scratching sound from the window made Sarah's head snap up. There, etched in frost on the glass, was a complex pattern of interlocking spirals and angles. As she watched, the pattern seemed to shift and flow, forming words. "Come to the woods, we have much to discuss." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. She could run, try to leave Silver Hollow and never look back. But deep down, she knew it was futile. The weaver's reach extended far beyond this small town. There was nowhere she could go that would be beyond their influence. No, there was only one path forward. Sarah had to confront the weavers to understand their purpose and find a way to break their hold, not just on her family, but on all of reality. With trembling hands, Sarah packed a small bag. Flashlight, water, her mother's book. She hesitated for a moment, then added the old family hunting knife from the drawer in the kitchen. It probably wouldn't be much use against beings like the weavers, but its weight was reassuring nonetheless. As she stepped out into the misty afternoon, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. Whatever happened next, at least she was done running, done hiding from the truth that had shaped her family's destiny for generations. The woods loomed before her, dark and forbidding. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Then, with one last look back at the house that had never truly been a home, she stepped into the shadows beneath the trees. The forest seemed to close in around Sarah as she walked, the mist thickening until she could barely see a few feet in any direction. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and an unnatural silence pressed in on her from all sides. She had no clear destination in mind, but something seemed to be guiding her steps, a faint tugging sensation that led her deeper into the heart of the woods. As she walked, Sarah began to notice strange things in her peripheral vision. Flashes of movement, glimpses of impossible geometries that vanished when she tried to look at them directly. The trees themselves seemed to be changing, their trunks twisting into unnatural shapes, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. And everywhere were the webs. They stretched between the trees, crisscrossed the path ahead, hung in gossamer curtains that Sarah had to push aside to pass. How long she walked, Sarah couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this place between worlds. But eventually, she emerged into a small clearing. And there, in the center, stood a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. It was an altar, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and squirm when Sarah tried to focus on them. And around the altar, moving with an alien grace that defied description, were the weavers. They were tall, impossibly thin figures, their bodies cloaked in shadow. Where their faces should have been, there were only knots of twisted silk, constantly shifting and reforming. And their limbs. Sarah's mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. They seemed to have too many arms, each ending in long, spindly fingers that never stopped moving, weaving complex patterns in the air. As Sarah stepped into the clearing, the weavers turned as one to face her. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical force, pressing down on her, threatening to crush her beneath its impossible weight. And then they spoke. Not with words, not with any sound at all, but directly into Sarah's mind. Their voices were a cacophony of whispers, a symphony of silk against silk, the sound of reality itself being woven and unwoven. "Welcome, child of the loom," they said. "We have waited long for your coming." Sarah swallowed hard, fighting down the urge to turn and run. She had come too far to give in to fear now. With a voice that only trembled slightly, she spoke. "What do you want from me, from my family? Why have you done all this?" The weaver's response was not in words, but in images that flooded Sarah's mind. She saw the birth of universes, the dance of realities splitting and recombining. She saw the weavers moving between worlds, spinning their webs, shaping the very fabric of existence. And she saw Silver Hollow, a nexus point where multiple realities intersected, a place of power and possibility. She saw her ancestors, generation after generation, playing their part in a vast and intricate design. "We are the shapers," the weavers' voices whispered in her mind. "We are the weavers of fate, the architects of reality. And you, child of the loom, are the key to our greatest work." Sarah's mind reeled from the onslaught of information, struggling to process the vastness of what she was being shown. But through it all, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. She had a choice to make, a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of all reality. As the weavers' voices faded, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her decision, she realized that this was only the beginning. The true test, and the true danger, still lay ahead. The webs of fate tightened around her, and Sarah Calloway stood at the crossroads of destiny, poised between unmaking and remaking the very fabric of existence. Sarah stood before the weavers, her mind still reeling from the cosmic visions they had shown her. The weight of her choice pressed down upon her like a physical force. She could feel the threads of fate tightening around her, urging her towards a decision that would reshape reality itself. "What exactly do you want from me?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "You say I'm the key to your greatest work. What does that mean?" The weaver's response came not in words, but in a series of images that flooded her mind. Sarah saw herself at the center of a vast web, threads of possibility radiating outward in all directions. With a single action, she could pull on these threads, collapsing countless realities into a single, perfect design. "You wish to consolidate reality?" Sarah gasped, struggling to comprehend the scale of what they were proposing. To eliminate all other possibilities and create a single, predetermined future. The weaver's approval hummed through her consciousness. They showed her visions of a world without chaos, without uncertainty. A reality where every action, every thought, was part of a grand, harmonious design. But even as the beauty of this vision washed over her, Sarah felt a deep sense of wrongness. The elimination of choice, of free will. It was a kind of death, wasn't it? A death of possibility, of hope, of the very essence of what it meant to be human. "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. The visions changed, showing her a reality unraveling, chaos consuming everything, the very fabric of existence torn apart by the competing pulls of infinite possibilities. Silver Hollow, her family, everything she had ever known or loved, lost in a maelstrom of unmaking. Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she faced. She thought of her mother, of the generations before her who had struggled against the Weaver's influence. Had they known? Had they faced this same choice? She opened her eyes, looking at the Weavers with new understanding. This isn't the first time you've tried this, is it? My ancestors. They refused you. The Weaver's silence was confirmation enough. Sarah felt a surge of pride in her family, in their strength to resist the lure of cosmic power and predestination. But now the choice was hers, and the consequences of refusal seemed too terrible to contemplate. As if sensing her thoughts, the Weavers began to weave. Their too many limbs moved in hypnotic patterns, spinning threads of reality before Sarah's eyes. She saw glimpses of the future they offered, a world of perfect order, of sublime harmony. It was beautiful in its way, seductive in its promise of an end to struggle, to uncertainty. Sarah felt herself being drawn in, the Weaver's vision wrapping around her like a silken cocoon. It would be so easy to give in, to accept their offer, and become the linchpin of a new, perfected reality. But as she stood on the brink of acquiescence, a memory surfaced. Her mother's words, written in that hidden book. The threads of fate are strong, but not unbreakable. Your choices, your will, these are the weapons the Weavers fear most. In that moment, Sarah understood. The Weavers, for all their cosmic power, could not simply impose their will upon reality. They needed her consent, her willing participation in their grand design. Which meant she had power. Real power, not just the illusion of choice. With that realization, the seductive pull of the Weaver's vision lessened. Sarah took a step back, then another, distancing herself both physically and mentally from their influence. No, she said, her voice soft but firm. I won't help you do this. Reality, life itself, is messy and uncertain and full of choices. That's what makes it beautiful. That's what makes it worth living. The Weaver's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The very air seemed to tear around them, reality wavering like a mirage in the desert heat. Sarah felt an immense pressure building, as if the entire weight of the cosmos was bearing down upon her, but she stood her ground. My ancestors refused you, generation after generation. Did you really think I would be the one to give in? We may be bound by your webs, but we will never be your puppets. With each word, Sarah felt a surge of power. This was her choice, her will asserting itself against the vast, impersonal forces that sought to control her. And in choosing, she was doing more than just refusing the Weavers. She was actualizing the potential they saw in her, becoming the linchpin of reality in a way they had never intended. The pressure increased, the world around her seeming to fray at the edges. The Weavers loomed over her, their forms twisting in impossible ways as they brought the full weight of their cosmic power to bear. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She reached into her bag, her fingers closing around her mother's book. The book that held generations of knowledge, of resistance against the Weaver's influence. As she pulled it out, the book fell open in her hands. And there, on a page she was certain had been blank before, was a pattern. A web, but unlike any the Weavers had shown her. This was a web of infinite possibilities, of choices branching out endlessly in all directions. Acting on instinct, Sarah began to trace the pattern with her finger. As she did, she felt reality shift around her. The Weavers' pressure lessened, their forms becoming less substantial. She understood then what she had to do. This was the way to break the Weavers' hold, not just on her family, but on all of reality. Not by destroying their webs, but by expanding them, by weaving in the infinite possibilities they sought to eliminate. Sarah poured every ounce of her will into the task, her fingers flying over the pages of the book as she traced pattern after pattern. Each one sent ripples through reality, opening up new pathways, new choices. The Weavers writhed in what might have been agony, their carefully constructed design unraveling around them. They reached for Sarah with their many limbs, trying to stop what she had set in motion. But it was too late. The wave of infinite possibility washed over them, through them. Sarah watched in awe as the Weavers themselves began to change, their singular forms splitting into countless variations, each one a different choice, a different path. And then, in a flash of blinding light, it was over. Sarah found herself standing alone in the clearing. The altar was gone, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. She could hear birds singing in the distance, the normal sounds of the forest returning, but things were not quite the same. As she looked around, Sarah could see the faint outlines of other realities overlapping with her own, not in a threatening way, but as a reminder of the infinite possibilities that existed in every moment. She had done it. She had broken the weaver's hold not by destroying them, but by embracing the very concept they had sought to eliminate. Choice, free will, the beautiful uncertainty of existence. As Sarah made her way back through the woods toward Silver Hollow, she felt a profound sense of peace. The burden that had weighed on her family for generations was lifted. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities. And if sometimes out of the corner of her eye she caught glimpses of gossamer threads connecting all things, well, that was okay. They were no longer chains, but reminders of the intricate, beautiful web of existence that connected all things. Sarah emerged from the woods as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Silver Hollow lay before her, familiar yet somehow new, filled with potential. She smiled, ready to embrace whatever came next. After all, the choice was hers.